This is Mr. Wesley, and today we are talking about a choice that a growing number of men over 60 are making in the years following their divorce. A choice that the culture around them consistently misreads, misnames, and responds to with a concern that is itself a form of condescension. The choice to remain alone, not temporarily, not while they recover and regroup and prepare to re-enter the relational marketplace that the culture assumes is the natural destination of every man who finds himself single but deliberately considered as a chosen and examined way of living that reflects something real about who they have become and what they actually want from the years they have left. And the culture's response to that choice is almost universally the same. Something must be wrong. He has not healed yet. He is afraid. He has given up. He is depressed in a way he cannot name or will not name. He needs to get back out there. He needs to meet someone. He needs to understand that isolation is dangerous and that connection is health, and that a man who chooses to be alone is a man who is choosing against his own well-being, whether he knows it or not. What the culture almost never considers is the possibility that the man who makes this choice has thought about it more carefully than the people offering their concern, that he has sat with the question of what he wants from the years he has remaining with a seriousness and a depth that the culture's assumptions do not have room for, that his choice to remain alone is not the absence of a decision, but the presence of one. Not a failure to connect, but a deliberate and examined preference for a particular quality of life, that the noise and the compromise and the emotional labor of a new relationship would diminish rather than enhance, that he has earned, through decades of marriage and the specific and demanding education of its ending, a clarity about himself, and about what he needs that most younger people do not yet have access to, and that this clarity, far from being a symptom of damage, is one of the most genuinely healthy things he has ever produced. Today I want to give that choice the serious examination it deserves. Not to argue that every man over 60 should choose solitude, not to romanticize aloneness as automatically superior to partnership, but to make visible the real psychology behind a choice that is being made by more men in this demographic than anyone is openly discussing, and to give the men who have made it, or who are considering it, a framework for understanding what they are actually choosing, and why that choice deserves to be held with the same dignity as any other. Stay with me. In a few minutes, I'm going to give you a clinical and philosophical framework for understanding the difference between chosen solitude and imposed isolation, a distinction that the culture consistently collapses and that, when collapsed, produces exactly the kind of misreading of men's choices that I described at the beginning of this video. I am going to give you the specific psychological research on what solitude actually does to a person who chooses it deliberately versus what isolation does to a person who has had it imposed on them. And I am going to give you a framework for evaluating your own situation with the precision that the question actually deserves. Not the framework the culture offers, which is organized around the assumption that aloneness is a problem requiring a solution, but the framework that begins with the question of what you actually want and what actually serves the life you are trying to build in this chapter. But first, you need to understand why the culture's reading of this choice is so consistently inaccurate. Because that inaccuracy is the source of most of the pressure that men in this situation face, and understanding it is the first step toward being free of it. I am Mr. Wesley. I have spent years working alongside men who were navigating the years after a long marriage ended. Men who were rebuilding, men who were renegotiating their relationship with themselves, men who were trying to understand who they were without the structure of the marriage that had organized their identity for decades. And among those men, a consistent and significant number arrived at a point where they made a clear-eyed decision to remain alone. Not as a default, not as a temporary condition, not as a failure of recovery, but as a genuine and considered preference for a particular way of living. The conversation around that decision, in almost every case, was inadequate to its seriousness. This is Relational Insights. And this is the conversation that decision actually deserves. Let me start with the cultural misreading and why it is as persistent as it is. The cultural assumption that aloneness is a problem requiring a solution is not arbitrary. It is built on a foundation of genuine research about the relationship between social connection and health. Research that consistently demonstrates that social isolation is associated with elevated health risks, reduced longevity, and a range of negative psychological outcomes that are as serious and as well documented as those associated with smoking or obesity. This research is real. It is significant. And it is consistently misapplied to the situation of men who choose deliberate solitude because it conflates two things that are psychologically and physiologically distinct. Isolation and solitude are not the same state. They produce different psychological and physiological outcomes. They are experienced differently by the person inside them. And the research that documents the health risks of social isolation is not, despite how it is frequently applied, a study of the health risks of chosen solitude. It is a study of the health risks of unwanted aloneness, of the specific condition of a person who wants connection and cannot access it, who is cut off from meaningful relationship by circumstance, by incapacity, or by the social conditions of their environment. That specific condition is genuinely dangerous. The research on it is genuinely important, and it has almost nothing to do with the situation of a man over 60 who has examined his own preferences carefully and concluded that a life organized around his own interior rhythms, his own priorities, and his own chosen relationships, relationships that are real and meaningful without being organized around a primary romantic partnership, is the life he actually wants. The distinction matters because the misapplication of the isolation research to the situation of men who choose solitude is the primary mechanism by which the culture generates the concern that these men then have to defend themselves against. When a man over 60 says he has chosen to remain alone, and the response he receives is organized around the assumption that he is describing isolation, the entire conversation that follows is proceeding from an inaccurate premise, and no amount of explaining himself within that conversation will produce genuine understanding, because the framework of the conversation itself has already defined his choice as a symptom rather than a decision. Let me give you the research that actually applies. Psychologists who study the relationship between solitude and well-being, as distinct from the relationship between isolation and well-being, have identified a consistent set of conditions under which chosen solitude is not only not harmful, but is actively associated with positive psychological outcomes, including greater self-knowledge, increased emotional regulation, enhanced creativity, reduced chronic stress, and what researchers describe as a more stable and less contingent sense of personal identity. The key variable in all of this research is not the presence or absence of other people. It is the presence or absence of choice. A person who is alone because they choose to be, and a person who is alone because they cannot help it, are in two fundamentally different psychological situations that produce two fundamentally different sets of outcomes. The research on isolation is a study of the second situation. The man over 60 who has examined his preferences and chosen solitude is in the first. There is a concept in the psychological literature on adult development called achieved solitude. This is distinct from imposed solitude and from the solitude of earlier life stages, which tends to be a byproduct of circumstance rather than a result of deliberate choice. Achieved solitude is the form of aloneness that becomes available to a person who has developed, through the accumulated experience of relationship and self-examination, a sufficiently robust interior life to inhabit their own company with genuine satisfaction, rather than merely tolerance. It is not available to everyone. It requires a certain density of self-knowledge and a certain stability of interior life that most younger people have not yet built, and that even many older people have not developed because the structure of their lives has never required them to. The man who has been through a long marriage and its ending, who has done the work of understanding what happened and what it means and what he actually is and wants apart from the structure of the partnership. That man has frequently developed exactly the interior density that achieved solitude requires, and choosing to inhabit that solitude deliberately, rather than rushing back into a relational structure that would impose its own requirements on an interior life that has finally found its own shape, is not a failure of recovery. It is one of its most sophisticated expressions. Picture this. There is a man I know, I will call him Vincent, who was married for 33 years and divorced at 62. Vincent spent the first year after his divorce in the way that most men in his situation spend it: disoriented, grieving, navigating the practical and financial reorganization of a life that had been structured around a partnership for 3 decades. He tried dating, briefly, because it seemed like the appropriate next step. He told me that the experience felt like trying to wear clothes that had been tailored for a younger version of himself. Not painful exactly, just wrong in a way that he could not quite articulate, but that his body registered clearly every time he sat across from a new person and felt the familiar machinery of relational performance starting up inside him. The calibration, the presentation, the management of impression, and felt simultaneously how exhausted he was by the prospect of running that machinery for another decade or two. Vincent stopped dating at 64. He told the people around him he was taking a break. He told himself the same thing initially. By 65, the break had become a preference, and by 66, the preference had become a considered and examined choice that he was no longer apologizing for or describing as temporary. He built a life organized around his own rhythms. His work, which he continued part-time because he found genuine meaning in it. His friendships, which he invested in with a seriousness and a consistency that his married years had not always permitted. his solitary interests, which expanded to fill the space that the marriage and then the recovery had previously occupied, and his relationship with his own interior life, which he described to me as the most honest and most satisfying relationship he had ever been in. He was not isolated. He had genuine and meaningful connections with a significant number of people. He was not lonely in any sense that the word accurately describes. He was alone in the specific and chosen sense of a man who had found that his own company was genuinely sufficient, and who had stopped apologizing for finding it so. I want to stay with that for a moment because the specific thing that Vincent described, the exhaustion of relational performance, is something that deserves to be addressed directly because it is one of the most consistently underreported dimensions of the experience of men over 60 who have been through long marriages. Relational performance is the term I am using for the specific work of presenting a version of yourself that is calibrated to the needs and expectations of another person in a romantic context. It is not deception. It is not manipulation. It is the ordinary and unavoidable process of mutual adjustment and impression management that is part of every early relationship, and that continues in modified form through the life of a long partnership. It requires energy. It requires the ongoing management of a gap between the self as it is and the self as it is being presented. And for a man over 60 who has spent decades running this process inside a marriage, and who has emerged from that marriage with a clearer and more settled sense of who he actually is than he has perhaps ever had before, the prospect of starting the process again from the beginning with a new person is not always experienced as exciting or hopeful. It is frequently experienced as genuinely exhausting in a way that has nothing to do with depression or damage, and everything to do with a realistic assessment of what the process costs and what it returns. This is not a universal experience. Some men over 60 find the prospect of a new relationship genuinely energizing. The opportunity for a different kind of partnership, built on the clarity that the first marriage's ending produced, with a person who meets them at the level of self-knowledge they have developed rather than the level they were at when the first partnership began. That experience is real, and it deserves to be honored as such. What I am addressing today is the experience of the men for whom this is not true. The men for whom the prospect of a new primary relationship is not energizing, but depleting. Not a hope, but a weight. And who are choosing, with full clarity and genuine deliberateness, to invest their remaining relational energy in forms of connection that do not require the specific overhead of a primary romantic partnership. That choice is valid. It is not damage. And it deserves a framework that honors its validity rather than treating it as a symptom of something that needs to be fixed. Let me give you that framework. These are the 4 questions that I believe any man over 60 who is navigating this choice should be able to answer clearly. Not to justify his choice to anyone else, but to ensure that the choice he is making is genuinely the one he wants to be making, rather than a default that has dressed itself up as a decision. The first question is, am I choosing solitude or avoiding intimacy? These are different things, and the distinction matters. Chosen solitude is organized around a genuine positive preference for a particular quality of life. The freedom, the interior space, the reduced emotional overhead, the ability to inhabit one's own rhythms without the ongoing negotiation that a shared life requires. Avoidance of intimacy is organized around fear. The fear of vulnerability, the fear of loss, the fear of another relationship ending in the same pain as the last one. Both can produce the same external behavior, a man who is not in a romantic relationship and who is not actively seeking one. But they produce different internal experiences, and they lead to different outcomes. The man who is choosing solitude from a position of fullness, whose interior life is rich enough to be genuinely satisfying as a primary source of meaning, and whose social connections are genuine and nourishing, is in a fundamentally different position than the man who is avoiding intimacy from a position of contracted fear. The distinction is not always easy to identify from the inside. It requires the specific kind of honest self-examination that most men find uncomfortable. But that is the only alternative to fooling yourself about which situation you are actually in. The second question is my social life genuinely sustaining me? Chosen solitude is not the same as chosen isolation. A man who has deliberately decided not to pursue a primary romantic relationship still needs human connection in forms that are genuine and nourishing. Friendships, family relationships that are invested in rather than merely maintained. Community in some form, organized around shared interest, shared work, shared purpose, whatever form is most resonant with who he actually is. The man whose social life outside of a primary partnership is genuinely sustaining is in a position to choose solitude as a deliberate and healthy preference. The man whose social life is thin, who is genuinely and consistently lonely in the texture of his days, who has allowed the structure of his marriage to substitute for all other forms of connection, and who is now finding that the absence of that structure has left him without meaningful connection of any kind. That man is not experiencing chosen solitude. He is experiencing imposed isolation that is presenting itself as choice. And the honest answer to this question will tell him which situation he is actually in. The third question is, what am I doing with the interior space that solitude creates? This is the question that most clearly distinguishes achieved solitude from mere aloneness. The interior space of solitude, the time and the freedom and the absence of the ongoing negotiation that a primary partnership requires, is a resource. It can be invested in ways that generate genuine meaning, genuine development, genuine contribution. Work that matters. Relationships that are deepened by the consistency of investment that solitude makes possible, creative or intellectual or physical engagement with the world that the busy decades of marriage and career did not leave room for. A relationship with one's own interior life that is more honest and more developed than anything the structured years permitted. The man who is using the interior space of his solitude in these ways, who can point to specific and genuine ways in which his life is fuller and more meaningful in solitude than it was in the marriage, is a man who is inhabiting chosen solitude as it is meant to be inhabited. The man who cannot answer this question, whose solitude is primarily experienced as empty rather than full, as absence rather than presence, needs to sit with the honest possibility that what he is calling a choice is actually a condition. The fourth question is, have I grieved the marriage fully? This is perhaps the most important question of the four, and the one that men in this situation most consistently skip, because the work of grief is uncomfortable, and because the structured life of post-divorce practicality gives a man many good reasons to defer it. A man who has not grieved his marriage fully, who has processed the logistics and the finances and the practical reorganization of his life, without sitting with the specific emotional weight of what ended and what it meant and what he lost, is a man who may be choosing solitude in part because the interior space it creates is also the space in which the unprocessed grief lives. The solitude is real. The preference for it may be genuine, but it is being chosen partly as a container for something that has not yet been fully faced. And that something, the unprocessed grief of a long marriage's ending, will continue to shape his choices and his experience until it is faced directly. Facing it does not require a therapist, though a good one can help. It requires the willingness to sit with the weight of what was, what it meant, and what its ending cost. Without rushing past that, sitting toward the practical next thing, the man who has done that work and who still chooses solitude is choosing it from a position of genuine clarity.